This has been a long time coming. The MegaMan Battle Network Legacy Collection has been, in no uncertain terms, one of my most anticipated game releases, maybe ever. For the longest time, I'd placed the mere concept of this collection on a pedestal alongside my other dream games. Kingdom Hearts 3, Xenoblade 2, and a remake of Explorers of Sky, just to name a few. Which, mind you, probably sounds mental, especially to other fans of those series, I'm aware. How could a bundle of 6 GBA ROMs possibly excite me as much as proper follow-ups and more modern, big-budget franchises? Surely my nostalgia for this Blue Boy turned executable isn't that strong, right? These are questions I've asked myself more times than I can count since the collection's reveal, and I've never really been able to even conceptualize a definitive answer. Believe me, I've had plenty of time to try. But ultimately, I found that it didn't matter. If a re-release of some of my favorite childhood games could elicit the same visceral reaction from me as when Sora got into Smash Bros. Or when Rescue Team DX was announced, then that just reinforces how much the series means to me. I'm not ashamed to admit that the first few seconds of that trailer were all it took to utterly break me that morning. And it didn't matter that there was no mention of online play or Boktai content or anything of the sort. The biggest hurdle to me was simply knowing that the collection was coming, and having literally anything beyond a logo and a black void to go off of. We had footage, and even a release window, vague as it may have been by Legacy Collection standards given the circumstances. Everything else could come in due time, and I was more than content to sit patiently, albeit vibrating with excitement all the while, and wait. And while the collection didn't appear often in the lead-up, that just made the few times Masakazu Iguchi reared his head all the more impactful. Every time this man turned to meet the camera with that distinctive white coat, or his name was in the headline of an interview, you knew he was likely about to knock you flat on your ass. People doubted that multiplayer would make the cut, yet he confirmed online functionality anyway, with local play on Switch as the cherry on top. He responded to feedback, like how the incident music in BN6's post-game was an oversight in development, and that it would at last be remedied. He even made the claim that the versions of these games in the collection would be source ports, something that technically savvy fans and modders alike insisted was nigh impossible. And well, we'll come back to that later, but the end result still proved far more than sufficient, even if the means to that end are a bit more complicated. Everything, and I mean everything, was lining up in a way that virtually assured that this was going to be one of the most impactful Mega Man releases in a long, long time. But that was then, and this is now. April 14th is long since come and gone, the dust is settled, and after following this collection from announcement to release, and even compiling a primer for potential new blood, I can finally toss my hat in the ring and speak my mind. And I have a lot to say about the final product that was laid before us on that fateful day, both positive and negative. I've no intention of mincing words or pulling my punches here. Battle Network sits alongside Pokemon and Kingdom Hearts as part of a nostalgic holy trinity for me, but that also means I'm inclined to hold this collection to a bit of a higher standard. I'm not some impossible-to-please snob, but I won't skim over any glaring omissions or flaws either. So without further ado, let's begin. This is the Mega Man Battle Network Legacy Collection. From the moment you hit the main menu, it's made abundantly clear that Iguchi and his team were hell-bent on going above and beyond the usual Legacy Collection fare. Recreating the display of a pet is genius in and of itself, especially given that the Switch version was almost assuredly the target platform for this game. But to go a step further and put MegaMan.exe inside the pet, with voice lines recorded by his original English, Japanese, and Chinese VAs, was a stroke of genius and phenomenal fan service. He'll give you time to answer if he asks something, he chastises you if you shake your controller, comments on important dates, and congratulates you when you finish and complete each game. He even has his own idle animations to boot. Delving a bit deeper, we find the bells and whistles one would expect from a Legacy collection. The art gallery and mystery data sections are two halves of a whole, housing a wide array of high-quality art across the entire series, and while they don't quite have everything on display, they at least covered ground I wasn't expecting them to. Concept and finalized art for the numbered entries is a given, and most of the side games you'd expect are present and accounted for, like Battle Chip Challenge and 4.5 Real Operation. But they even managed to squeeze in material from the JP mobile phone games, Phantom of Network and Legend of Network. And I'm obligated to highlight that the first thing you're greeted with in Volume 1's mystery data is promotional art for Operate Shooting Star. You know exactly where I'm going with this. All that's not to say I have no nits to pick with the collection's gallery offerings, however. OSS and Phantom of Network being here makes the lack of Double Team DS or network transmission quite jarring. Almost as if they forgot to include the games rather than it being a deliberate decision. And look, I give network transmission a lot of shit, but Zero's Battle Network redesign absolutely deserved to make the cut for the world to see. It's easily the best part of that game, barring its OST. My other gripe necessitates jumping the gun a bit, but I feel it's appropriate to address this here. Almost every battle chip has had their art redrawn for the updated trading menus, and to say that they look stunning would frankly be an understatement. Which makes the inability to view said artwork outside of chip trading an utter travesty. This is the first time most of these chips have seen a glow up like this, and while I can admire them from outside the game since the files have been dumped, I shouldn't have to resort to that when it should have been feasible in the collection itself. You can't even full screen them when you're in the process of trading, you're just stuck with how they're displayed on the battle chips, and I sincerely hope that they're willing to address this oversight with battle cards if they do get around to Star Force. Outside of all that, the rest of the collection side offerings aren't anything out of the ordinary. Trophies are baked in as per usual, and task you with anything from completing side quests to using all of the souls or crosses in a given version, and the music player is what you'd expect, though the option to change the menu's BGM to any song is a very welcome addition. I personally set mine to Firefield and Seek a Chord respectively. Though there is one caveat to the music player, and it's a small one at that, but the sparse selection of Legacy Collection tracks is a bit of a letdown. Excluding the 4 pre-order remixes, you only have the title screen songs to listen to, and that's a shame considering there's an entire set of remixes that are being sold, but just aren't here. Surely including all of the remix tracks wouldn't have hurt the sales of the soundtrack on Steam. And if that really wasn't on the table, including the new credit songs would have at least softened the blow since they're tracks that are in the collections. Look, I get it. I'm sure that going into such excruciating detail over JPEGs and a glorified sound test might come off as overkill, but seeing as collections like these are explicitly produced with the intent to celebrate and memorialize the series they're representing, I think it's important to recognize how much care has been put in and what can be improved even if marginally. This attention to detail and how the games are housed is arguably just as important as the treatment given to the games themselves. Because not appreciating work like this and being complacent is how you end up with sterile, lifeless re-releases like the Mario 3D All-Stars collection. Both of these offerings were priced at $60, and yet even without talking about the games included, you can immediately tell which one was phoned in and which one had the staff busting their asses. And that extends to the games themselves, since every entry has had its title screen remade from the ground up to a mostly flawless effect aside from Battle Network 4's logo flashing a bit faster than normal. It's having a bit of a stroke. which I suppose is appropriate given how the rest of that game is held up over time. But it's not a big deal, all things considered. The border options all look incredible as well, and at every screen scaling option to boot. And while the option was absent at launch, black borders were restored as a version 1.0.3 for those who prefer playing that way. It's only when you go beyond the title screens that things start to become a bit more divisive? Yeah, that's the word I'd use to describe this. Let's hit these plot points in order. For reasons I can't wrap my head around, the smoothing filter is enabled by default. And forgive me for wanting to really drive this point home, but in a nostalgia-driven collection of GBA games that are remembered for their exceptional pixel art and sprite work, the filter that only serves to damage that art style is on by default. Why? I'm not even asking to remove the option entirely, because I know there are people who genuinely prefer playing with smoother visuals, and far be it from me to deny them their preference. The solution? Display a prompt for players booting up the collection for the first time that shows them what the games look like with the filter on and off before they even hit the title screen. As long as you convey to the player that they can change that setting at any time, everyone wins. And on the topic of something I wish you could change at any time, that brings me to this. This ugly, bland, typewriter-ass font that they chose to use when localizing the collection. Now, full transparency, I found myself becoming more numb to the font than anything by the time I reached the end of Team Proto-Man, but the fact that my disgust could only barely elevate to indifference after an entire game says a lot. And you can't tell me that choosing the right font isn't important, because if it wasn't, Square wouldn't have made it a selling point for the Pixel Remaster ports after they got mauled for lacking it at launch. If your game is dialogue heavy and lacks voiceover, it's more important than you might think to make the text your players are reading look appealing. Aside from those hiccups though, the games have been faithfully lifted from the GBA and into the modern day quite gracefully. The sprite work looks incredible when it's not being bastardized by the filter, and holds up surprisingly well even at the largest scaling option on my 40-inch TV. The English script is more or less unchanged, aside from a few names in Battle Network 6, like Spoutman reverting to Aquaman for parody with BN4, and Japan Man being changed to Samurai Man? Capcom. It's 2023, and Devil May Cry is one of your most popular IPs. You can just call him Yamato Man now and Westerners won't bat an eye. I promise. This decision to leave the original translations all but untouched is one I've seen a decent bit of discourse over, and I can understand where both sides are coming from, even if I'm a bit biased. This was probably the last chance these games had of getting their bevy of spelling and grammatical errors fixed in an official capacity. And from the outside looking in, a $60 collection in 2023 that occasionally reads like this doesn't bode well. But these games aren't from 2023, are they? These aren't remakes or remasters, they're ports of early 2000s RPGs that aim to retain as much of the experiences that fans remember as possible. The Tree Bomb Prism combo was left unchanged in PvE, but nerfed to the ground for PvP, while some glitches like Reddit skip were patched, others like the Life Virus skip, Gospel Duplication, and BN4's No Encounters are still present. The incident theme that blares in BN6's post-game was fixed, which, again, even Iguchi admitted was a development oversight, and that it was never meant to keep playing after the credits. Hell, a Warner Brothers style disclaimer for culturally insensitive content was placed before the title screen just so they could keep BN2's script intact. Preservation was clearly the intent behind this project, and as an enjoyer of Load Chod, There's So Many Electrical Store, and every BN fan's favorite dead horse to beat, I wouldn't have it any other way. And as the cherry on top, they retained the Boktai scenario in BN6, which for all intents and purposes doubles as restored content for Western fans, complete with its own hilarious on-brand typo. That being said, I can't act like that decision had no chance of enabling a certain degree of negligence in the localization process, to put it lightly. Namely in the case of Battle Network 6. Look, Django conflating a blood-sucking vampire and a rock and roll cyber terrorist is fucking funny. And even the Seaside 1 NPC failing to finish their line about the map had me dying of laughter. But sabotaging the means of obtaining Django 3 for library completion by copy-pasting the English text, and then taking over 2 months to address a single line of text? That's not quite as amusing. And I'm aware that you could avoid this by switching the language to Japanese before engaging with the V5 virus battler, but a workaround existing didn't make it acceptable or not worth patching. Prior to the latest patch, it was easily my biggest hang-up with the entire collection. Which is saying a lot, because online play comes pretty close behind that from what I've seen. Now I want to stress that what I'm about to say in regards to the online functionality comes almost solely from secondhand experience. My Switch is 2 whole floors above a middling Windstream router that begs for death every time I upload, and I think we can agree that weak wireless net play wouldn't make for an accurate assessment. So for better or worse, I really have no choice but to live vicariously through sources like the N1GP and DemiDURMC, who've held tournaments for the collection across both Steam and Switch. Let's just address the elephant in the room now. Excluding the use of Tango, the net play on offer is both delay-based and peer-to-peer. If I was talking about a fighting game, that'd be a death sentence, and I could end the video right now. Thankfully, PvP isn't Battle Network's primary appeal, but since official net play was one of the collection's biggest selling points, I'm not exactly inclined to give it a pass either. Given how low Mega Man seems to rank on Capcom's proverbial totem pole, it doesn't surprise me that the netcode isn't up to snuff compared to their FGC offerings, but it's a letdown nonetheless. And that's not to say it makes PvP on consoles unplayable, but it certainly makes the prospect of playing against randoms all the more daunting. If you can find a random that's willing to play. Because something even I was able to test is how easy it is to find a game, and simply put, I didn't. Across BNs 1, 5, and 6, I consistently failed to find a single game. I set my region accordingly, which is to say I set it incorrectly out of necessity, expanded the search range ad nauseum, and fiddled with different rule configurations, yet came back with nothing. And while crossplay would alleviate this to an extent, I'd argue it's the sheer volume of PvP settings that instigates most of this headache. I understand wanting to retain them since the options were in the originals, but they clearly don't make for streamlined matchmaking. Look at triple battles. In what world is locking yourself into a best of 3 with someone preferable to a best of 1 with the option to offer a rematch on ladder? Practice and real thing only serve to dilute an already limited player base, and be honest, does anyone like giving up battle chips for losing? There's just a lot of fat that clearly needed trimming, but wasn't. As for the experience once you find a match, it's mostly positive, all things considered, with one caveat if you're not playing in an N1GP event. The Psybeast chips, Gregar, Falzar, and especially Double Beast are all legal on ladder, and I still can't quite process why they thought that was a good idea. They require very little to no setup and have little counterplay in contrast to their obscene damage output. Don't get me wrong, I think Double Beast is one of the coolest chips in the series in PvE, but that just doesn't translate when playing against a real person. A more positive change, however, is that a new custom window timer has been added to bring the Battle Network games in line with Star Force 3, albeit with a much shorter 30 seconds on the clock as opposed to that game's 120. Though I will note that this timer was only raised from 20 seconds to 30 as of that pesky 1.0.3 update that I have to keep shoehorning in because Capcom's timing is as impeccable as it is infuriating. And last but not least, do these renditions of the games perform well in a single-player setting, and how much of an impact do Buster Max mode and patch cards have on them? To fry the biggest fish of the bunch first, all 10 games thankfully exhibit no signs of frame dips or, more notably, input delay whatsoever from my experience. This is presumably due to the unhinged pseudo-emulation wizardry that the devs opted for as a workaround for the looming assembly language conundrum. And while this means that the games aren't cut and dry ports like Iguchi suggested, I'm also willing to cut him some slack given the end result. Plus, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say that shit like this wouldn't have made for engaging or even comprehensible pre-release material for the average fan, let alone new blood. Though I should note that I managed to crash Volume 2 once in my 120 hours of playtime while recording footage for the final Virus Battler, though I couldn't begin to tell you how. As for the new additions, they're actually more difficult to judge than I expected them to be. At first, I was inclined to say that Buster Max is the more meaningful of the two, and you could make that argument since it functionally invalidates random encounters, mostly streamlines chip farming, and is available in every game. Even I can't deny how universal it is, and for good reason since it isn't a carryover like patch cards. But I can't stress enough, namely as someone who's far more attached to the latter half of the series, just how transformative patch cards are. Since BN4 was the first entry to support the e-reader, you can tell that they hadn't quite gotten a handle on how to implement the peripheral, and as a result, the cards range wildly from feeling either bland like HP increases or extremely experimental. From pet and Mega Man color swaps, changing your charge shot to chips as strong as full cust, to toggling permanent double soul and auto guarding, some of BN4's patch cards are more akin to cheat codes than anything else. And I kinda like how unhinged they are. They're not as utilitarian or complex as later entries, but they spice up combat with a sandbox-like quality that's not dissimilar to the enjoyment I get out of messing with the crosses in Battle Network 6. They can trivialize most of the game if you want them to, and while I wouldn't play BN4 like this all the time, I'd argue that mulching encounters with a 2k plus HP roll soul has its own appeal. And having a plan B for when I inevitably miss Searchman's scenario in Red Sun is very, very much appreciated. I'm getting Search Soul whether the game likes it or not, no matter the cost. The only gripes I have with BN4's patch cards are that most of them feel too basic, and that some cards clash with only 6 mod address slots on hand. Why do back and B effects and panel altering cards share an address with 1/2 of all guard? And why do the Buster patches need to share the same slot as mods that change the Buster into a completely different attack? I can't really bring myself to stay hung up on these questions for long though, because by BN5 onward it's made pretty clear that they cracked the code. The mod address system is replaced by an 80 megabyte limit, and every installable patch card has a file size based on what effects the card bestows. Keyword being effects, because now the cards are based on viruses and navis, and their buffs and bugs alike are meant to emulate the enemy each card is emblematic of. BN5 even includes a few cards that pack pretty nice customizer programs like Millions, Battery, and Fish, and they inexplicably baked what's arguably the most useful subchip into a card that's only 18 megabytes. Item cards are also introduced here. Single-use bonuses that reward anything from a clown's pocket change to a near-indestructible barrier commonly wielded by the cyberworld's god of destruction. They can trim down the completion process by giving you V2 and 3 chips for a number of navis, and even just having a surplus of Zenny, subchips, and bug frags on standby is a huge quality of life buff for a normal playthrough. Patch cards can spice up BN4's New Game Plus runs, or give you even more ways to snap BN6 in half if you can believe it. And I'd be remiss if I didn't recount how I made the Shademan liberation in BN5 harder by forgetting to turn off fast gauge, only to then deliberately handicap myself for the rest of the story because I appreciated having the option to shake things up. I just can't sing their praises enough. When I say that their effects on the games they apply to are transformative, I really mean it. I wasn't sure what to expect going in since I'd never messed around with them before, but these things might honestly be my favorite addition in the entire collection. I think I've made it abundantly clear that the Battle Network Legacy Collection is far from perfect. Even after the latest update did some much needed housekeeping, the font remains untouched, the netcode is still far from ideal for non-Tango battlers, and just about every one of my minute misgivings, from the cumbersome method of viewing redrawn chips to the lacking selection of remixed music, are present and accounted for. But even in spite of all those flaws, including the ones that were present at launch, I still can't help but adore this collection and the people who brought it to life regardless. Because at the end of the day, I just wanted an official means to play these games on modern hardware, with all of the Legacy Collection bells and whistles, and to see a whole handful of new fans experience some of the unhinged shit this series has to offer. And I got that in spades, with so much more. I got to watch my MegaMan move 1 million units in only 2 weeks, chasing right behind the lifetime sales of MegaMan 11. Believe me, this tweet gave me the greatest feeling of catharsis in the world. MegaMan as a whole isn't quite out of the woods yet. 12 and Tyson are still stuck on the COVID delay docket, and the series producer seat is now in desperate need of filling. But this collection doing as well as it did, alongside the swift announcement of X-Dive Offline, speaks to a far brighter future for the Blue Boy than I would have ever considered hoping for prior to all this. I can feasibly hope for a Star Force collection and a Legends collection so I can finally try that series. Maybe even an interquel in the BN and Star Force universe if I really want to shoot for the stars. But as with most Mega Man related matters, and I assure you, I'm just as tired of saying these words as I'm sure you are hearing them, we'll just have to be patient and wait. Now if you'll excuse me, I have other business to attend to. Fire-breathing ovens, haywire traffic lights, and an interrogation with whoever designed this fucking power plant. See you for Battle Network 1.